Hey, everybody, it's Drew Scooter from Sleep With Me podcast. I'm answering Wednesday Wonder questions. Right now, I'm answering one question real quick, but this is streaming live. So if you're on YouTube and you see this, post your question in the chat. I'll try to answer it. I'm going to be on here for like 5-10 minutes. Okay, so the question came up in Sleep With Me Plus Discord for Sleep With Me Plus. If you join Sleep With Me Plus, make sure to join the Discord. It's like probably the best way to keep in touch. Okay, so Fog E4Fem asked, I'm just going to read their thing and then kind of in episode 1235, Notebooks of Journey into World of Friends series review, talked about how you realized, the characters need to be in game. And then you started saying something that sounded very interesting, but you keep starting over. So I ended up not understanding what you were talking about. One like this. Also, I mean, I'm sure I can't point to this directly. This is quoting me, but there is like listening to listeners, but it's not like, and the seeds being planted and empathizing and having compassion, putting myself in the listener's shoes of like just these subtle things that people say. And then I coach that with like, please don't send harsh feedback because that won't help. But it means I'm listening to constructive feedback or what people are talking about around the episodes. I don't know. Just the idea that actual play show has exclusivity. I don't know. I just have a sense that also influenced where suddenly the story had to be was just a work of fiction, not a fictional actual play fiction. So that'll take a little bit of explaining. It's a good question, though. So the original season 1 was called Journey into the Land of Tomorrow, and it was a fictional series of a group of fictional friends playing a fictional role-playing game. And so it kind of had this nested thing where there was this group of friends and they were playing a fictional board. I just repeated myself. But it was based on the idea of podcasts that are like actual play podcasts. It wasn't an actual play podcast because it takes place in a kind of future timeline. But it was influenced by that idea and me playing D&D during the pandemic and on Zoom and stuff. And just the idea of like the mechanics of friends playing D&D offers this interesting level of interpersonal dynamic and conflict and tangents that just adds a nice layer to a story and to Sleep With Me in particular, where actual play podcasts are actual people playing a podcast, which is also cool in a non-fictional dynamic because people are going to have conflict. Some people are going to be more extroverted and introverted. Some people are going to be more funny and some people are going to be more serious. Some people are going to be prepared. So all those things add interesting layers of conflict into the story, which I know most casual listeners of Sleep With Me don't you're not directly impacted by the conflict in the story, but conflict in stories is just necessary even in Sleep With Me. Otherwise it wouldn't be a story. And I don't think the show would work. But it has to be kind of conflict that's, fits in a sleep podcast. So that was the whole Journey into the Land of Tomorrow was kind of based on that concept. So it was very focused on the friends and the game mechanics of like a game similar to Dungeons and Dragons. But what I learned after the episode had been out, after that season had run and stuff, is like just through subtle conversations or subtle feedback that like, and the same goes for Star Trek: The Next Generation for some reason, like the idea of saying a role-playing game and Dungeons and Dragons, this is very strange. You only learn this on Big Sleep Podcast, or the idea of saying something is based on Star Trek. Those are, I don't understand. I don't quite understand it, but like those create like a thing that people are, wary's the wrong word, but people have a presumption that it's not for them. Like they have an assumed preference. I think that's the right word. They have an assumed preference that they haven't actually they say, oh, well, I had that assumed preference about Star Trek The Next Generation. So that's kind of like, yeah, that's kind of correct. Like, it's like, oh, I just assume that show isn't for me. And then my preference is to watch something else. And the same goes for D&D or role-playing games specifically, though I'm sure if I did video games or something like that, I mean, there's other stuff in there that, but it's like, as soon as it hits there's an inflection point based on feedback and conversations where I could tell. So it was like, I could see like, oh, we're right on the borderline of an inflection point here where just the idea that it's based on a role-playing game is pushing people away from the episodes. And it's more of something that you don't make a direct decision on. You kind of say, okay, so I'm aware of that. That's interesting. Like, and it even took now for me to put words to it. It's like, oh, that's kind of like an assumed preference or a presumed preference. It's not a real preference because it's never been explored. But most people don't have, life's pretty intense, right? So most people don't have the time or resources to want to even explore presumed or assumed preference. And it's like, okay, if my preference is not to play role-playing games or to listen to Star Trek or watch Star Trek, I'm not going to explore that. Like, I got enough going on, you know, my life's full enough and I have enough options. And so when I made season 2, I still was kind of going into it with the actual play idea, but maybe a little bit softer version of that. And this might not mean anything to anybody that's not into any of this specific conversation, but this is just a good question. It just like the feedback guided me as I was exploring the story. And it was only one part of like, oh, maybe we need to take this in a little different direction. And it was a very subtle influence where it was like, as I was finding my way through the first episodes of Journey into the World of Friends, that it was like, oh, maybe this shouldn't be about the role-playing game. Also is like, I talked about this in that episode. It's like, it also creates it's like writing two kinds of fiction that take place within one another is a lot more demanding, especially when there's the mechanics of a role-playing game. So you're actually writing like kind of 3 different levels of fiction. You're writing the mechanics of the role-playing game, the story of the role-playing game, and then the fictional interaction of friends. And then actually there's this layer of the how do they're also portraying their characters. So I think that answers that question. So yeah, and then Jacqueline's on here. Hey, Jacqueline. And yeah, Jacqueline, like me, kind of, I was like, oh, I don't think Star Trek The Next Generation's my thing, man. Like, and I think it was Jonathan Mann, maybe, that was like, man, I think you should really check it out. Like, he got into it when it was, because it was like syndicated show, and he was like, I don't know, I think you should take a look at it. I'm pretty sure that's what pushed me over, and I was like, oh, maybe I will. Like, he's kind of like, it's the perfect kind of vibe. It has a vibe, right? And it's a perfect vibe for Sleep With Me. And I think like the humanism aspect and just the episodic aspects, but also the strong characters and great performances make it good. But it's also a show we don't do too much because of that fact. Like, the podcast not really in a position where we could, it's hard to put out episodes where like 10 to 30% of the audience is like, I just won't listen to that episode, because that creates a big cascade effect on the ability to keep making the podcast. So yeah, so that's an interesting question. I'll be back with another question. But yeah, if you have any questions, I got to break these videos up because it's easier to share on social media, even though, of course, I went on for 8 minutes. But yeah, thanks, Jacqueline, for joining, and thanks, everybody.